Ransomware. Isn't that the real threat? I mean, that's the question that comes up with this all the time. But in fact, it's not. It's the state of the nation of our networks today. That is the real threat. Because any one or all of these issues that are listed, these are vulnerabilities. Now, another term you may see mentioned in the industry today are edges. That's applicable as well, users, devices, transitions from one network to another. But it's all of these things together that, if not properly addressed, are opening the door to ransomware. So what I want to do for the next 15 minutes or so is to go ahead and look at kind of a recap of where we are today, a little bit of what we can expect, and then to wrap it up with what I think are the key messages, the key building blocks to go ahead and minimize the possibility of being infected by ransomware. So first of all, what should we know about it? The problem with ransomware is the emotional aspect of it. We read about organizations, municipalities, regardless of who the target is, and they've lost their data and being held for ransom. In some cases, they're paying the ransom. In other cases, they're trying to recover their data. But the key thing to keep in mind about this, ransomware is malware. And a little bit of what the previous speaker was touching on, that it is malware, and we need to have the right security posture in place to keep that malware out, because malware doesn't suddenly mysteriously get into the network. It uses well-known attack vectors, well-known attack techniques, something as simple as you've won $1 million on an email. Because we know statistically that some percentage of people will click on that email, and a further percentage of people will click on the attachment. That's the entry point. And that may be coincidental, it may be a targeted attack. The ransomware piece of it, you're getting the notification that your data has been exfiltrated and you need to pay a certain number of bitcoins to get it back, that's the last step of the process. By the time you get that, it could have been days, weeks, or even years from the time of the initial infiltration to the time that you're getting the ransomware attack, or I should say the ransomware demand. Regardless, it is a growing industry, and if we think back to 2017 with WannaCry and NotPetya, these were early implementations of ransomware. And the criminal organizations, the hacker organizations that are behind this, they're just like organizations. I work for a global organization, Fortinet. We have engineering, we do quality control testing, we do beta tests, limited releases to early customers, and so on. The hackers do exactly the same thing. And so in a lot of cases, I should say there's a school of thought that NotPetya was an early release to see if it worked and what kind of damage it could cause. But we've seen in the 5 years since then the onslaught and the success of these different ransomware attacks and the different strains that are coming out. And most of them are variations of a theme. But again, going back to what I was saying in the beginning, looking at how networks are constructed today and the vulnerabilities that are in them, it's no surprise that we're seeing an increase year on year in terms of the number of attacks, the amount of ransom that's being paid, and organizations that are suffering. Now, we looked at statistics, and these come from the research arm of Fortinet, where in 2020, 2021, we were tracking where attacks were taking place. And like commercial organizations, hackers are very opportunistic. So what was a big thing going on the last 2 years? Vaccine development. So we saw a dramatic increase in the number of attacks in the academic world, because particularly for the AstraZeneca vaccine, that was in strong collaboration with the academic community here in the UK. We saw that statistically, that hackers were spending more and more time trying to get into the universities and higher education institutes, get into the process, because those are high profile, high value targets. And a lot of organizations when they read about it or experience, seem to think or focus on this idea of, well, I'll have a good backup plan. Make sure that my files are backed up, preferably off-site, not on the same network, and that will protect me, and maybe I'll buy some cyber insurance as well. Well, those things are good. Those are good practices, but it doesn't alleviate or negate the need for basic cybersecurity principles. Having the right technologies in place across all of the attack surfaces, keeping those systems up to date, and then combined with good cyber hygiene. That's the key. I can't say that even that will prevent you. There's nothing that can stop every threat from getting into the network. It's how you respond to it once it gets in, which is the key. But it's all these things together, finding the right balance between technology, practices, and hygiene that improve your ability to make sure that you're not the next victim in the chain. So what can we expect over the next year, if anybody can accurately predict that far in advance? Well, first of all, it will become more aggressive because they've seen their success. They've also seen organizations start to refuse to pay ransom. There was a recent incident in France where a large defense contractor announced that they had been attacked. There was a piece of ransomware in part of their network, but they came out in the press and said, we're not paying the ransom. We believe we have the necessary means to recover our data, and we're going away. We're not going to submit to the demand. So in response, what we're seeing is more aggressive ransomware that destroys some of the files as a means of prompting a payment sooner rather than later. We're also seeing the use of other techniques such as DDoS being used in conjunction. Now, this is not a new technique. Several years ago, we saw a number of instances where DDoS was used as a diversionary tactic while the hackers were exfiltrating data. This was before the concept of ransomware. They just wanted the credit card records, social security numbers, whatever it might be, and using a DDoS attack to divert attention away from what they were doing. So we expect to see this trend continue. Something that was just mentioned about AI. Yes, we think of it being used defensively, but if we have it, the hackers have it as well. And it's an interesting thing. One of my colleagues recently talked about this, that the technology is machine learning. That nodal network that gets set up with all the computers and learns from what has happened in the past to predict what might happen statistically in the future. The outcome of that is what we call AI, and it's the same thing. The hackers can build up the same networks that we have on the defensive side. In a lot of cases, the hacker criminal organizations are better funded and certainly less rigid than large corporations are. They're very rapid. They respond very quickly. So it's no surprise that they see the tools that we're using to combat them to be used to improve their abilities to get into the network. A few years ago, it was thought that Apple, Mac OS, iOS, was inherently more secure than Windows. Well, it really turned out that it's not the case. The opportunity was in Windows because of the sheer number of machines. The opportunity was so much greater. Once the hackers turned their attention to Mac OS and iOS, the same attacks were taking place. And now it's the case of Linux. We see more and more attacks, or we believe more and more attacks will be geared to the Linux operating system. And then finally, and this is the consequence of a digital transformation effect, is this idea that operational technology networks will be next on the list. We already had a number of disturbing attacks last year in the United States. Colonial Pipeline cutting off the access of fuel all along the eastern seaboard. There was a meatpacking plant in the Midwest in the United States that was also impacted. This is as a result that organizations, by embracing digital transformation, have hooked up what was a separate network into their IT network. So this integration between IT and OT, getting rid of the infamous or mythical air gap, has now put OT directly in the sights of ransomware as well as malware in general. So what are we doing? What's the state of the defense? Well, first of all, from a corporate perspective, this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue at the executive level. The IT teams traditionally have been the ones responsible for dealing with it, but now, because of the consequences, because of the risk of losing proprietary data, the possibility of having to pay millions out in ransom, this is becoming a key boardroom issue. And we're seeing more and more organizations, including cybersecurity, in their corporate social responsibility statements. They understand that by collecting and maintaining data, customer, employee, partner data, it goes beyond the duty of care to protect it. There are real consequences by not protecting it. So the focus is getting stronger, the pressure is getting stronger and stronger to what are we doing to make sure we're not the big headline. And this is an opportunity where other organizations, vendors in the cybersecurity space start to take advantage of it by prompting or promising a silver bullet. One technology that will solve all the problems. One that gets mentioned quite a bit in this is EDR, Extended Detection and Response. Now, that is a good technology and it has a role to play, but it absolutely must be part of a larger strategy. And having these capabilities, bringing this together, not as a bunch of individual products, but in a structured approach where these products actually work together. And that brings a point that our friends at Gartner made late last year, moving away from a point product approach. Because what they were seeing is that large corporations in particular were working on a product-by-product, problem-by-problem basis. And in the end, what they would have would be a collection of products that each one worked exactly the way it was supposed to. But it was never designed to work with a product to the left or to the right of it. So they've proposed, or they floated the idea, we need to move away from this and go to a more collaborative, a more integrated environment, what they call the cybersecurity mesh architecture. Now, you can't buy cybersecurity mesh architecture. It's a concept. Quite honestly, at this point in time, it's a wisp of smoke because Gartner's throwing this out there to see what sort of attention it will get. And they've gone ahead, whoops, I haven't signed out. They've gone ahead and gone into some detailed drawings and trying to simplify the explanation. It probably makes it a little bit more complicated. But it is this idea that get away from this point product, best of breed approach. Each product works, but not together. And so they floated this idea and went ahead and announced several organizations who have something that approximates this CMSA. At Fortinet, it's what we call the Fortinet Security Fabric. Now, to put this in perspective, Gartner announced this CSMA late last year, 2021. Fortinet introduced the Fortinet Security Fabric in 2016 with the initial development or the initial concepts being introduced as far back as 2012. So this has been a happy intersection of what we believe is the right approach to cybersecurity and what Gartner has finally come around to this idea of it's not throwing out everything that you have and go with one vendor, but it's a rationalization and a consolidation of how many vendors you actually want to work with. And each of those vendors' solutions or platforms can actually work with other vendors. That is the direction that Gartner is going in. And it's that collaborative approach, having the 3 layers of cybersecurity, not 2. You still need a preventative layer. There's no question about that, because the massive amount of attacks happen with malware that's already known. So why wouldn't you filter that out in the beginning? But then you back that up with a detection layer and finally through automation, a response layer. It's only by having all 3 that you're able to properly defend the network and minimize the chance of a successful cyber attack, whether it be ransomware or not. So to wrap it up, this is not going away. It's an industry on its own, and particularly with ransomware as a service. Don't even have to be smart or a clever hacker. You just need money. You can buy a service with SLAs and guarantees. Understanding the cause of ransomware, why an attack is successful, and what's needed to counter it, and understanding the same old things we've been talking about for years. Education, awareness, in addition to the technologies, are the keys to a successful cybersecurity defensive strategy to minimize an attack, to minimize, they might still get in, but if you can detect and block before they get to their objectives, you've been successful. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the moderator.
Patrick, thank you very much indeed.